Okay, class. Let's continue. Okay, so again, as discussed earlier, definition of lease. Okay, lease is a contract or part of a contract. At ano nga uli ang contract? As defined in PFRS 16, an agreement between two or more parties, in this case, the lessor and lessee, that creates enforceable rights and obligations. Okay? In particular, ano yung rights and obligations na yan? On the part of the lessee, okay, right to use the underlying asset. Okay, of course, kapalit ng right to use na yan, obligation to make lease payments. And if the asset, okay, will not transfer, if ownership will not transfer to the lessee at the end of the lease term, obligation to return the underlying asset. So ito yung right, okay, right to use the asset, ito yung obligations on the part of the lessee. How about the lessor? Okay, obligation to transfer the right to use. Okay, so right to use the underlying asset. Kapalit niyan, syempre may marireceive ang lessor. So right to receive the lease payments. And at the end of the lease term, kung walang transfer of ownership, rights retained in the underlying asset. Okay, of course, yan na yung problema natin ngayon. Accounting for those rights and obligations. Okay, so notice, yung rights and obligations na yan, depende kung kaninong perspective. Lessor ba or lessee? Kaya sa mga problems, dapat clear muna. Teka muna, sinong ina-account natin? Lessee or lessor? Now, unahin natin si lessee. Okay, so lessee accounting muna tayo. Mamaya na yung lessor. Okay, isa-isa lang muna para hindi magulo. Okay? So, lessee's perspective. Okay? So, on the part of lessee, yung right to use the underlying asset na yan, kaya yan yung tinatawag na right of use asset. Okay? So, actually, pwede naman gumamit ng ibang term such as lease asset. Kaya lang, ang specific na ginamit sa standard yan, right of use asset. Yung obligation, yan yung lease liability. Okay? So in effect, sa part ni lessee, anong i-account natin dyan? Yung right of use asset at yung lease liability. And yung related income and expenses dyan. Okay? Now, so doon tayo sa accounting perspective of lessee. Okay, number 11. At commencement date, so dyan nire-recognize commencement date. A lessee shall recognize, so required, shall recognize a right of use asset and a lease liability. Okay? So actually, under PFRS 16, okay? So required na ngayon na si lessee mag-recognize ng right of use asset and lease liability. Before kasi may tinatawag na operating lease, finance lease. So doon lang sa finance lease nagre-recognize. Okay, so under the new standard, isang model na lang. Okay, isa in effect, finance lease na lahat. Okay, so with certain exceptions. So generally, finance lease. And ano requirement? Magre-recognize ng asset and liability. The question is, why? Bakit ni-require na si lessee ay mag-recognize ng right of use asset and liability? Okay, so why? Because, ayan, ako, pag sinabing because, lumalabas na si Chris Aquino. Okay, ang sagot dyan, letter C. Those are the reasons. Okay? So, yan yung reasons kung bakit in-amend or ni-revise yung standard on leases. Okay? So, letter A. Because at the start of the lease, a lessee obtains the right to use an asset for a period of time. So, meron siyang asset. And if payments are made over time, incurs a liability to make lease payments. So as noted earlier, yung lease na yan may na-create na right and obligation. So dapat mag-recognize ng asset para doon sa right, mag-recognize ng liability para doon sa corresponding obligation. Okay, and also letter B, because the absence of information about leases on the balance sheet meant that investors and analysts were not able to properly compare companies that borrow to buy assets with those that lease assets without making adjustments. So actually, nung PAS 17 pa, di ba nga may operating and finance? Okay. So in most cases, sinasadya na yung lease gawing operating para off balance sheet. Hindi makikita sa balance sheet yung asset and liability. Okay? So kaya kapag ikaw yung investor, let's say mag-i-invest ka kanino ka mag-i-invest? Kay company A or kay company B? Si company A, bumibili siya ng assets using borrowed funds. So nangungutang siya para mabili niya yung asset. Ito namang si company B, nagre-renta lang siya. Okay? So, kaya itong si company A, pag tinignan mo yung balance sheet niya, may asset, may liability. Pag tinignan mo yung balance sheet ni company B, walang asset, walang liability kasi operating lease. So, pag i-compare mo ngayon, which one is better? Okay, company A or company B? So, nahihirapan ang investors at yung mga analysts. So, kaya nung ginagawa nila, ina-adjust pa nila si company B as if finance lease para comparable siya kay company A. So, with the new requirement, okay, basta may lease, may asset, may liability na yan. So, comparable na ngayon si company A at si company B. So, si company A na bumibili ng asset using borrowed funds at itong si company B na nagli-lease. So, whether you buy or you lease, same lang ang nasa balance. Parehong nasa balance sheet yung asset and liability. And that's actually the main reason, okay, kung bakit ni-revise yung PAS 70, yung IAS 70 na yan, to bring leases on balance sheet. Okay? So, kaya malilesen na yung tinatawag na off-balance sheet financing. Operating lease is an example of off-balance sheet financing. Wala sa balance sheet. Okay, yung asset and liability. Kaya nahihirapan yung mga investors, nag-a-adjust pa sila. And considering na ang investors ay isa sa primary users of FS, kinonsider ng IASB yung information needs nila. So kaya yan, kaya ni-revise. Okay, yung accounting for leases on the part of lessees. Okay, so again, at commencement date, debit, right of use asset, credit, lease liability. So why? Those are the reasons. Okay, so 11, letter C. Okay, so again don't forget our key accounting issues template. So NRM TPD. And as noted already, dalawa yung i-account natin sa part ni lessee. Right of use asset. Okay. And lease liability. Now, para hindi tayo ma-confuse, okay, para hindi mag-mix up, isa-isay natin. Okay, unahin muna natin yung right of use asset. Mamaya na yung lease liability. Okay? So, in relation to right of use asset, okay, number 12. At the commencement date, that's when to recognize, a lessee shall measure, so initial measurement, measure the right of use asset at how much? Letter A, at cost. Lagyan mo ng note. In the old standard, kapag finance lease, kay delta, lower of the fair value of the asset at yung present value of the minimum lease payments. So, under PFRS 16, okay, nakaspecify na cost and dinefine kung anong kasama sa cost. That's number 13. The cost of the right of use asset shall comprise letter A. Okay? At anong mapapansin mo dyan sa cost? Similar to PPE. Okay? Itong 1 and 2, ito yung pinaka-cost of purchase. Yung 3, yung directly attributable cost. Tapos yung 4, estimated. Okay? Dismantlement, removal, yan, restoration. Okay? Kaya kung i-relate mo siya sa PPE, yung right of use asset parang PPE, yung composition ng cost. Okay? So, yung number 1, the amount of the initial measurement of the lease liability. So, mamaya discuss natin yan. Okay? So, ano ba yung kasama doon sa measurement na yan ng lease liability? Kasi yan yung isasama natin as pinaka-ano niya, purchase price. Number 2, any lease payments made at or before the commencement date. Okay, less lease incentives received. Kasi itong liability yung hindi pa paid. So, ito yung paid na. Okay, so before pa yung commencement date. So, by the way, in relation to number 2, merong guidance dyan ng PIC, ha? So, ito yung ni-release ng 2020. So, 2020-06, yung payments between lessors and lessees. Yan. So, paano ina-account yung specific payments? Medyo marami yun. So, refer to that Q&A for the guidance. Okay, so number 3, initial direct cost. So, yung initial direct cost na yan, parang ano yan directly attributable cost. Yan. So, kaya kasama siya dun sa cost of right of use asset. Okay, and then number 4, estimate of cost. Okay, to be incurred by the lessee in dismantling and removing the underlying asset, restoring the site on which it is located, or restoring the underlying asset to the condition required by the terms and conditions of the lease. Unless those costs are incurred to produce inventories. Kasi yung cost incurred to produce inventories, accounted for yan as inventories. Hindi yan kasama sa cost ng right of use asset. Similar to the concept of PPE. So dito sa number 4, ang guidance natin dyan, PAS 37, provisions. Kasi pag isinama ito sa cost, so hindi siya lease liability. Ito kasi yung lease liability. Ito, liability rin ito. So ang tawag, provision. At dahil estimate yan, nagbabago yan. So IPREC 1, okay, accounting for changes. Tapos may guidance din dyan ang PIC. So 2019-08. Okay. So itong topic ng provision, i-discuss natin yan later. Okay, separately. So in the meantime, just take note. Yung number 4 na yan, kasama yan sa cost kapag nag-qualify yan as provision. Okay. So part of cost siya, tapos ang credit, liability, provision. Okay, so notice na similar to PPE initially at cost. And then in-specify kung anong mga kasama sa cost ng right of use asset. Okay, so 13, letter A. So ito yung summary regarding right of use asset. Okay, right of use asset, nature. An asset that represents a lessee's right to use an underlying asset for the lease term. Recognize when? At commencement date. At ano nga uli ang commencement date? The date on which A lessor makes an underlying asset available for use by a lessee. So at commencement date, debit right of use asset. How much? At cost. Okay. Subsequently, after commencement date, paano ng measurement niyan? Okay? That's number 14. Yan. So, which statement is incorrect regarding measurement of right of use assets after the commencement date? So, meaning, ito na yung subsequent measurement. A is a correct statement. Okay, a lessee shall measure the right of use asset applying a cost model. So, as a rule, cost model. Unless it is required, okay, or chooses to apply, okay, chooses to apply other measurement models. At ano yung other measurement models na yun? Okay, ito yung fair value and revaluation model. So B is also correct. If a lessee applies the fair value model in PS40 to its investment property, the lessee shall, so required, also apply that fair value model to right of use assets that meet the definition of investment property in PS40. So ito yun, yung required. Okay? So pag yung right of use asset kasi pwedeng PPE yan eh. Pwedeng investment property yan. Okay? So kapag ka yung right of use asset nag-qualify as investment property, then okay, pag ang ginagamit na model ng entity ay fair value model, yung right of use assets mandatory dapat naka-fair value din. C is incorrect. If right of use assets relate to class of PPE to which the lessee applies the revaluation model, the lessee, mali yung shall. Okay? So, optional. Optional. Okay? So, the lessee may also apply. So, mali yung shall also apply. So, may also apply the revaluation model to all of the right of use assets that relate to that class of PPE. So notice the difference. Kapag investment property, okay, tapos gumagamit ng fair value model, yung right of use asset na investment property dapat fair value model din. Pero kapag yung yung right of use asset ay PPE, tapos gumagamit ang entity ng revaluation model, optional na gamitin ang revaluation model. Hindi siya required. So kaya as a rule, cost model. Unless required, ito yung required sa letter B. Or chooses to apply, ito yung letter C. Okay? So, ito yung summary. Subsequent measurement of right of use asset. Okay, as a rule, cost model. And take note this is cost model specified in PFRS 16. And under the cost model, okay, the asset carried at cost less any accumulated depreciation and any accumulated impairment losses. So similar to PPE. Kaya lang, ina-adjust for any remeasurement of lease liability. So, di ba nga yung lease liability, kasama yan sa cost? Okay. So, pagka nagbago yung liability na yan, ina-adjust din yung right of use asset. Okay. So, kaya affected ng remeasurement of the lease liability yung carrying amount of the right of use asset. So, yung cost model dito, hindi ito cost model ng PAS 16 ha. Ito ay cost model of PFRS 16. And that's the measurement under the cost model. Okay, fair value model. So if the right of use asset is investment property and the lessee applies the fair value model in PAS 40, the entity is required to use the fair value model. for its right of use asset. Okay, revaluation model, if the right of use asset is PPE and the lessee applies the revaluation model in PAS 16. Kaya lang, optional. Okay, kaya mali kanina yung letter C. Hindi mandatory yan. Ang required lang dito sa fair value model. So that's the subsequent measurement of right of use asset. Okay, now changes in carrying amount using the cost model. So initially at cost. Okay, decrease by what? Depreciation and impairment. So by the way, yung depreciation, ang guidance dyan, PAS 16. Okay? So kung ano yung alam natin sa PAS 16, okay, na concept ng depreciation, same lang ang i-apply. Okay. So ang right of use asset subject yan to impairment under PAS 36. Okay? So kaya notice similar to PPE. So using cost model, cost less depreciation less impairment. At yung depreciation guidance ng 16, applicable din yan sa right of use asset. So yung impairment in 36, covered dyan ng right of use asset. Now, as noted earlier, ang lease liability, okay, so kasama yan dun sa cost, okay, ng right of use asset. So initially debit, right of use asset, credit lease liability. Kaya pag nagbago itong lease liability, magbabago din ang carrying amount of the asset. It's either increase or decrease. Okay, at kung magkakaroon ng lease modifications, affected din ang carrying amount. So kaya ito yung mga problem natin na ma-encounter regarding right of use asset. So pwede mong ma-encounter, tatanungin ka, cost of the asset. Okay? So take note of the items included in cost. So yung depreciation, impairment, so yung alam natin sa depreciation and impairment ng PPE, applicable din. Okay, sa right of use asset. Then, ito yung mga iba pang problems. Pag nagkaroon ng remeasurement of liability, okay, or nagkaroon ng lease modifications. Now, in relation to depreciation, number 15, which statement is incorrect? Regarding depreciation of right of use asset, okay, A is a correct statement. The depreciation policy for right of use asset held should be consistent with that for owned assets. So, paano yung sa owned assets? Ganun din. Dapat sa right of use asset. Ang issue lang dyan is yung depreciation period. Okay? B is also correct. If the lease transfers ownership of the underlying asset to the lessee by the end of the lease term, so ibig sabihin, eventually, si lessee ang magiging owner. Or, if the cost of the right of use asset reflects that the lessee will exercise a purchase option, so either merong transfer of ownership or merong purchase option na likely i-exercise ni lessee, then the lessee shall depreciate the right of use asset from commencement date to the end of the useful life of the underlying asset. So simply stated, kapag eventually si lessee ang magiging owner, okay, ang gagamiting depreciation period, lease term. Rather, useful life. Yan. From commencement date, okay, up to the end of the useful life of the underlying asset. Okay, incorrect is letter C. Otherwise, the lessee shall depreciate the right of use asset from commencement date, okay, to the mali yung later. Dapat earlier. So earlier of the end of the useful life, okay, or the end of the lease term. Okay, so to summarize, ito ang issue regarding depreciation, hindi yung method eh. Ang issue dyan is the depreciation period. Kailan mag-start, kailan mag-stop. Anong gagamitin ba? Lease term or useful life? So, this one, the depreciation timeline. Depreciation begins, okay, at commencement date. So, at commencement date, depreciation of right-of-use asset starts. When to stop? Okay, ang ating guide question, will lessee obtain ownership at the end of the lease term? So, eventually ba ang magiging may-ari niyan si lessee? Pag ang sagot ay reasonably certain, then end of useful life. That's when to stop. At kailan reasonably certain? Kapag may transfer of ownership or mayroong option to purchase. And it is likely that the lessee will exercise the option. Eh, paano kung not reasonably certain? Okay, then earlier of the end of the lease term and useful life. So whichever is earlier. Kaya mali yung letter C. So to illustrate, number 16, the requirement, annual depreciation. Okay, so the entity leased a machine with a fair value of 165,000. Ignore yan. So dati relevant yan eh. Kasi kino-compare yung fair value of the asset and present value of MLP. Okay, so ngayon, anong requirement? Cost. At anong kasama sa cost? Okay, so yung initial measurement of the liability, so ito yun, present value of the lease payments discounted at the rate implicit in the lease. So ito yung pinaka purchase price. Okay, so present value of lease payment. So that's effectively the purchase price. Initial direct costs include, so parang siya, directly attributable cost. Okay, so total cost. Now, the useful life is 5 years. The lease term is 4. So, yun ang issue ngayon. Okay? Divide by 5 or divide by 4. Again, depende yan whether the lessee eventually will become the owner or not. Now, after 4 years daw, the asset can be acquired for a near zero cost. Magkano yung near zero? Let's say, okay, 1 peso. Yan, near zero. So, ang tanong, kung near zero yan, most likely ba bibili ng lessee yan? Pinapabili na lang ng 1 peso after 4 years. Okay, most likely ba i-exercise ni lessee yung right na yan to buy? Well, it will depend on the fair value of the asset when the option becomes exercisable. Kasi baka mamaya, after 4 years, ang value naman pala talaga niya, piso na lang, then hindi bargain. Yung tinatawag na bargain, purchase option. So, hindi bargain yung 1 peso. Kung ang fair value niya ay 1 peso din. Pero dito, in-specify, yung near zero cost daw na yan, substantially below the expected value of the asset at that date. So meaning, okay, dahil substantially below, okay, yung dahil yung option price ay substantially lower than the fair value, malamang gagamitin ng lessee yung option. So eventually, who will become the owner? Lessee. So kaya gagamitin natin useful life. Since eventually lessee will become the owner. So answer? Okay, number 16, letter C. Okay, so that's emphasis on depreciation. Now, yung other changes in the carrying amount, i-discuss natin yon in relation to liability. Kasi yung carrying amount ng right of use asset, affected siya by the remeasurement of the lease liability and lease modifications. Okay, now let's proceed to presentation. Which statement is incorrect regarding presentation of right of use assets? So, paano ba mag-appear sa FS yung right of use assets na yan? A is a correct statement. A lessee shall either present in the statement of financial position or disclose in the notes right of use assets separately from other assets. So, yung right of use asset na yan, okay, pwedeng line item siya sa balance sheet or pwedeng i-disclose lang sa notes. Pero dapat separate from other assets. B is also correct. If a lessee does not present right of use assets separately in the statement of financial position, then the lessee shall disclose which line items in the statement of financial position include those right of use assets. So ano ibig sabihin? Pwedeng makita natin mismo sa balance sheet right of use assets or yung right of use assets included in another line item. Okay? At kung kasama siya sa another line item, dapat i-disclose kung anong line item yon. For example, PPE. So isinama yung right of use assets sa PPE. So dapat naka-disclose siya. Okay. C is also correct. Right of use assets that meet the definition of investment property shall be presented as investment property. Okay? So, ang right of use asset, again, pwedeng PPE yan, pwedeng intangible asset yan, pwedeng investment property. So, kapag yung right of use asset ay investment property, dapat i-present siya as investment property. Pero kung let's say yung right of use asset ay PPE, pwede siyang i-separate, i-present separately or as part of what? PPE. So, basta ang importante dyan, i-inform ang users na merong right of use asset. Okay, either nakaseparate nga yan sa face ng balance sheet or nandun lang saan? Notes. Okay, basta importante dyan, ma-identify na merong right of use asset. So, answer Delta. All the statements are correct. Okay, now the credit side, liability. So, debit, right of use asset. Credit, lease liability. So, ano bang nature nitong lease liability? So, yan ay liability that represents a lessee's obligation to make payments for the right to use an underlying asset for the lease term. Okay, so recognition also at commencement date. So at commencement date, debit, right of use asset, credit, lease liability. Okay, so the initial measurement, present value of lease payments that are not, of course, ang liability not yet paid. So not paid at commencement date. Okay. In particular, ano yung kasama sa lease payments na yan? So that's number 18. At the commencement date, the lease payments included in the measurement of the lease liability comprise the following payments for the right to use the underlying asset during the lease term that are not paid at commencement date. Again, ang liability hindi pa paid. Okay? So, anong kasama dyan? Letter A. So, yan yung sa tinatawag na lease payments. Okay. And what are those? Number one, yung fixed payments, including in substance fixed payments. So yung in substance fixed payments, nakastructure siya na variable. Pero in substance, fixed yung payment. Okay? Less any lease incentives receivable. Number two, variable. So yung number one, fixed. Itong number two, variable. So kaya lang, yung variable lease payments, kasama lang yan kung yan ay dependent on what? Index or a rate. At yung index or rate na yan, initially measured as at the commencement date. Okay? So, minsan tawag dyan, inflation-linked payments. So, normally kasi pag variable, hindi kasama yan eh, yung fixed lang. So, pinayagang isama yung variable provided inflation-linked. Okay? So, ang basis ng variable is payments, index or rate. Number three, amounts expected to be payable by the lessee under the residual value guarantees. Okay? So, pwedeng i-require ng lessor kasi itong si lessee na i-guarantee yung residual value para pag-ingatan. Okay? So, kapag yung residual value lower, okay, than the guaranteed amount, then magbabayad ang lessee. Kaya lang take note, para magbayad si lessee, dapat ang mag-guarantee si lessee mismo or a party related to lessee. So minsan kasi merong third party guarantee. So anong gagawin doon? Ignore. So exclude third party guarantee. So yun lang guaranteed by lessor, by lessee or a party related to the lessee. So kung guaranteed by third party, hindi yan babayaran ng lessee. Number 4, exercise price of a purchase option if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise that option. Okay, so kung may option to buy, okay, kasama yun kung i-exercise. Okay, at kailan i-exercise yan? Kapag ka-bargain. So yung option price significantly lower than the fair value of the asset when the option becomes exercisable. Okay, and then number 5, payments of penalties for terminating the lease if the lease term reflects lessee exercising option to terminate the lease. Okay, so 18, letter A. So di ba minsan may termination option at pag terminate may penalties. So isasama yon kapag okay, kapag reasonably certain, okay, na-exercise, okay, yung termination option. Okay, so 18, letter A. So simply stated, ano yung 1 to 5 na yan? Okay, ito yung lease payment. So meaning, ito yung amounts na pwedeng bayaran ng okay, na lessee over the lease term. So it could be fixed payments, variable. Kaya lang yung variable kapag ka-inflation linked. So let's say nakabase siya sa sales. So hindi kasama yan. Dapat inflation linked. Okay? Kung may guaranteed residual value, okay. So pagka yung value later on ay lower, okay, than the guaranteed amount, magbabayad ang lessee. So ganun din, syempre, pag i-exercise na yung option to buy. Okay, yung penalty kapag in-exercise yung termination option. Okay, so that's the initial measurement of lease liability. At yung amounts na yan, i-discount yan. Dapat present value of the lease payments. So ang tanong, using what rate? Okay, so number 19. The lease payments shall be discounted using Kung available, letter A, interest rate implicit in the lease if that rate can be readily determined. In most cases, okay, ang ginagamit pag hindi available yung A, letter B. The less is incremental borrowing rate. So if interest rate implicit in the lease cannot be readily determined. So ibig sabihin, letter C. It could be A or B. Kung available yung A yan ha, gagamitin lang yung B kapag hindi available yung A. Okay? So 19, letter C. At ano ba yung tinatawag na incremental borrowing rate na yan? Okay, that's number 20. A, no. Naalala pa ba yung A? The rate that exactly discounts estimated cash receipts through the expected life of the financial asset to the gross, yan, gross carrying amount of the financial asset. So naalala pa yan? That is the effective interest rate. So, highlight natin yan sa discussion natin ng financial assets and liabilities. Okay, so pag hindi nga given, di ba, kinumpute pa natin yan, effective interest rate na yan. Letter B, yan na yung tinatawag na credit adjusted effective interest rate. So, applicable to purchase or originated credit impaired financial assets. So ito yung mga financial asset na nung bilhin or in-originate, impaired na. Okay. C, no. Yung letter C, that is the interest rate implicit in the lease. At kung available nga yung interest rate na yan, use that to discount the lease payments. Kung hindi available yan, then incremental. And that's letter D. So the rate of interest that a lessee would have to pay to borrow over a similar term with a similar security, the funds necessary to obtain an asset of a similar value to the right of use asset in a similar economic environment. So meaning, kung hindi nag-lease, bumili ng asset at mangungutang sa bangko, so magkano kaya yung babayarang interest? So yan yung incremental borrowing rate. Okay, so 20, delta. Okay, changes in the carrying amount of the lease liability. So initial measurement, okay, interest. So, yung unwinding of the discount, di ba naka-present value to? Okay, due to passage of time, mag-i-increase yan. At yung increase in the carrying amount because of passage of time, that's interest. So, minus yung lease payments made. Okay, tapos remeasurement, lease modifications, pwedeng plus, pwedeng minus. And as noted earlier, yung remeasurement and lease modifications na yan, affected din yan ang right of use asset. Okay? Now, to illustrate computation of the carrying amount and the presentation, number 21. So actually itong 21, ang focus natin dyan, okay, presentation. So ang requirement, non-current. As of December 31, 2020. Okay, so here's the background. On December 31, 2019, the company leased a machine, okay, for its entire economic life of 5 years. Equal annual payments under the lease term, 525,000. Kaya lang kasama doon yung 25,000 annual executory costs. So yung executory costs, yan ay costs of ownership. Example yan, maintenance, yan, insurance. Now, ang kasama lang sa lease payments, yung payments for the right to use the underlying asset. Kaya kung payment yan for executory costs, hindi dapat kasama yan sa tinatawag na lease payments. Kaya 525 minus mo yung 25. It should be 500 only. Okay? Now, the first payment was made on December 31, 19, so advance. And the second payment was made on December 31, 2020. Implicit rate given, 10%. Now, the entity learned that a third party guaranteed to pay the lessor a residual value of 200,000. Sinong nag-guarantee? Third party. So dahil third party guarantee yan, walang kinalaman dyan ang lessee. So sa part ng lessee, ignore. Irrelevant. Relevant yan kay lessor, pero irrelevant kay lessee. Kasi ang nag-guarantee third party. So walang requirement na bayaran niya ng lessee. Okay, so initial measurement of the liability, that's 500,000. I-discount natin at 10%. Okay, term 5 years. Advance. So the first payment made on December 31, 19. So advance. Okay, get the present value. 500,000 excluding executory costs times the factor. Okay, 500,000 times the factor. Ano itong factor na ito? Advance annuity. 10%. Okay, 5 periods. Okay, for emphasis, gawa natin to ng traditional schedule. So parang nag-amortize ng loan. Okay, on December 31, 19, okay, initial CA, this one. Kaya lang yung first payment made in advance. So the first payment, 500,000, excluding executory costs. Yung executory costs, expense yan when incurred. Since advance payment itong 500, applicable to interest, 0. The entire amount, okay, deduction from the carrying amount. So the entire amount applicable to principal. So the previous carrying amount minus, okay, so yung principal repayment. Okay, so balance at December 31, 19 after the initial payment. So dahil advance ka yung payment, ito yung magiging basis na ng interest 2020. So the second payment made as scheduled December 31, 2020, 500,000. This time, i-apply mo na sa interest. So the previous CA times 10% applicable to interest. Okay? So, total payment minus applicable to interest, the rest principal. And that will decrease the carrying amount. So, previous CA less the payment applicable to principal. So, that's the lease liability at December 31, 2020. Kaya lang, ang question, non-current. So, dahil in effect, installment yan, itong carrying amount na ito, ipepresent yan as current, non-current. So, magkano yung non-current? Kunin natin yung current portion. So, actually, yung non-current, that's the carrying amount at December 31, 2021. So, 500,000. Previous CA times 10%. Previous CA times 10% applicable to interest. The difference applicable to principal. So as of this date, ito yung balance sheet date, This is the balance. Okay? So, paano ang presentation? Payable within 12 months, ito yun, current portion. So, ito yung current. So, total balance minus the current portion, the difference, non-current. So, yung non-current is in effect yung carrying amount at December 31, 2021. So, 21, letter C. Okay, 21, letter C. So, again, ang requirement non-current. Now, okay lang dyan sa problem, pinakita natin yung schedule. E paano kung lease term 20 years? Tapos hinanap non-current after 10 years. So, matrabaho yan kung gagawa ka pa ng schedule. Okay, ang alternative dyan, itong CA na ito is simply present value ng lease payments yan. Kaya ang shortcut para makuha itong amount na yan, simply discount the remaining cash flows. So let's try. As of December 31, 21, nakailang payments na? 3. Kaya kung 5 payments yan minus 3, 2 payments na lang. So kaya ito, para makompute yan, simply discount the remaining 2 payments. So alternative computation. 500,000 times the factor. 10%, 2 years remaining. So notice, hindi eksakto, no? May konting difference due to rounding. Naka-round up kasi yung present value factors. Kaya hindi nag-tie up. Okay? So minimal na yan dahil lang yan sa rounding. Okay. So that's the preferred, by the way yan yung preferred approach in determining current, non-current. Kaya lang, ito na namang PIC, nag-release uli ng guidance. Okay? In determining current, non-current portion of the lease liability. Okay. And in that guidance, merong option. So, dalawa actually. So, ito, yan yung preferred. Paano yung alternative? Ang alternative, i-discount yung bawat payment. Okay? I-discount siya. So, ibig sabihin yan, dahil annually nagbabayad, so i-discount for one period. So, ibig sabihin, yung current portion naka-fix na. So, this one, lagyan ng note This is in accordance with PIC Q&A number 2019-11. Okay? So, under this interpretation, ito yung preferred. So, ganyan, yan, gagawa ng schedule. Ang alternative daw dyan, yung 500,000 na payable next year, kunin yung present value. That's the current portion. So, 500,000 simply divide by 1.1. That's how to get present value. Okay? So, that's the current portion. So, yung present value ng payment annually, yun yung current. Paano kukunin yung non-current? So, ito yung carrying amount as of this date. Okay, minus the current portion. So, non-current, alternative answer, delta. So, notice, in accordance with this interpretation, it's either letter C, lagyan mo ng note yung C, preferred, or letter D, alternative. So, under the alternative, naka-fix yung current portion at this amount. So, kung magkano yung present value of the payment. Okay? Pero generally, ito ang ginagamit. Mas preferred ito. So, yung parang loan amortization schedule. So, as of this date, this is the balance and this portion is current. This one is non-current. Okay, next. Lease-related expenses. So ano ba yung typical expenses na may encounter natin sa part ng lessee? Of course, una na dyan yung interest. Then, if the asset is depreciable, depreciation. Ito yung dalawa na common expenses related to leases. Interest and depreciation. And that's the requirement in number 22. Okay? So, lease-related expenses. Okay. Of course, sagutan natin yan after a short break. Okay? So, short break ulit tayo.